The M18 Hellcat moved like nothing else on tracks in the Second World War because it was built around a single idea that sounded reckless until it started working. If you could arrive first, shoot first, and relocate before the enemy could answer, you didn't need thick armor to survive. That mindset produced something rare, a vehicle that became the fastest armored fighting vehicle employed by any side during the war, with a top speed reaching about 55 miles per hour. It looked different for a reason. Open-topped, lightly protected, almost impatient in its design. Yet this was the US Army's tank destroyer that produced a kill-to-loss ratio commonly cited around 2.4 to 1, an efficiency number that many larger, more celebrated Allied vehicles struggled to reach across the same war. And still, in popular memory, the Hellcat remained strangely quiet, overshadowed by tanks that were built in bigger numbers and celebrated in simpler stories. So we are going to dig into what the Hellcat actually was, how it fought, what kind of battlefield moments inflated its success, and why its reputation never grew in proportion to its results. The doctrine that created the Hellcat began as a very American attempt to solve an armor problem with organization as much as with steel. In 1941 and 1942, the US Army watched how German armor broke fronts in Europe and reached a clear conclusion. The answer wasn't to make every tank into a perfect tank killer, but to build a separate arm whose entire purpose was stopping armored breakthroughs before they became disasters. That was the tank destroyer idea. Hold fast-moving anti-tank units back, feed them information, then hurl them to the threatened sector like a fire brigade, arriving as a concentrated gun line that could shatter an enemy thrust through coordinated fire and rapid maneuver. But what that doctrine demanded more than anything was time advantage, because you couldn't concentrate if you arrived late, and you couldn't choose the engagement if the enemy had already crossed the key road junction and started rolling up your rear. American manufacturers answered the Army's requirements with a flood of prototypes, rolling out more than a dozen concepts as the tank destroyer idea took shape. But the process never stayed still, because the moment one requirement was met, the battlefield produced a new demand, and the program slipped into a steady cycle of revisions. Faster, lighter, better armed, easier to build, and ready sooner. The M10, built around the proven M4 Sherman chassis, became a dependable fighting vehicle and did solid work against German medium panzers in North Africa, where reliability and a workable gun mattered more than perfect specialization. Even so, it wasn't the end goal the tank destroyer leadership had in mind. They were still chasing a more focused answer, one that put speed and mobility first, stayed cost-effective enough to field in numbers, and carried the firepower to hit hard the moment a target appeared. So when the US started refining the concept, it became obvious that the vehicle wasn't supposed to be a miniature heavy tank, and it wasn't supposed to survive by absorbing punishment. It was meant to survive by arriving where the enemy didn't expect it, firing first, and ending the exchange before German crews could settle into their own rhythm. That logic shaped the Hellcat's design, and that was why it looked stripped down on purpose. The easiest way to understand the Hellcat was to start with one number, because it instantly told you what kind of machine this was. The M18 could reach roughly 55 miles per hour on the road, and in 1944, that speed wasn't a brag, it was a tactical advantage. It let a battalion shift sectors quickly, cover a threatened approach, arrive early to a key road junction, and build a firing position in time to shape the fight instead of chasing it. That speed also shaped how Hellcat crews thought. The vehicle encouraged a style where movement was part of the plan from the start, because survivability came from positioning and relocation as much as it came from thickness of armor. Under the skin, the number that powered the whole idea was 400 horsepower. The Continental R975 Radial pushed that power into a vehicle weighing roughly 17 tons combat loaded, which put the Hellcat around 23 horsepower per ton. A Sherman usually lived closer to 12 to 13, and a Panther struggled to reach around 15. On paper, the top speed drew attention, but the real payoff was acceleration and responsiveness. The Hellcat could reposition fast enough to change the geometry before the enemy fully reacted. Three engineering choices made that speed usable in combat rather than theoretical. First, the drivetrain. The M18's Torqmatic automatic transmission gave it a responsive, repeatable feel under pressure. That mattered when a commander needed a fast shift to a new lane of fire without losing momentum. The Hellcat didn't just have a high top speed, it got there fast. Crews described it as leaping forward when the throttle opened. That meant it could burst into firing positions, break contact, and reposition before German gunners completed a full turret traverse. Now the second, armour, or rather, the deliberate lack of it. The thickest plates sat around the mid-20mm range, the sides ran thinner, and the turret stayed open. That trade kept the vehicle light enough to preserve its power-to-weight edge, and it gave the crew strong visibility. The open turret helped crews read the fight faster. Engine notes, dust plumes, quick silhouettes at a hedge line. In a tank-destroyer fight, those seconds decided who fired first. Third, suspension. The M18 rode on torsion bars, and that helped keep speed controlled when the crew had to stop, settle, and shoot quickly. Speed is useless if it shakes your gun into a blur and turns your first shot into a hopeful guess. The Hellcat was built for motion that still felt controlled, and that control meant the 76mm gun could arrive in a position where it actually had a chance to hit on the first attempt, the shot that mattered most. And there was one more overlooked piece: gun handling. The 76mm M1A1 wasn't the biggest gun on the field, but in the Hellcat, it moved quickly and balanced well. Crews could swing onto target, fire, correct, and fire again, faster than in heavier vehicles, and a practical rate around 10 rounds per minute meant follow-up shots arrived fast. When you were working angles instead of trading front plates, that second round often finished the job. So the advantage stack was simple and repeatable: speed to reach the flank, visibility to spot first, and gun handling to finish quickly. That was how kill ratios got built, less by raw armor, more by controlling time and angle. The Hellcat didn't need to win every head-on contest to be dangerous, because its best fights didn't happen in the center of the road with both guns already aimed. It needed the enemy to rotate, to commit to a lane, to expose a side for a few seconds while momentum carried the vehicle forward, and that was where the Hellcat lived: forest edges, road bends, hedge gaps, crest lines, and those brief moments when armor had to move before it could properly fight. That was why shoot and scoot didn't feel like a slogan in an M18. It felt like the vehicle's natural rhythm. The first shot set the terms, the exit kept you alive, and the next position kept you dangerous, because the Hellcat's real advantage wasn't thickness of armor. It was the ability to keep changing the question the enemy had to answer. And when you looked at the numbers, you could see what happened when Doctrine finally met a machine that fit it. The M18 was widely credited with 526 enemy vehicles destroyed and 216 Hellcats lost, producing a commonly cited kill-to-loss ratio around 2.4 to 1 overall. In Europe, the commonly cited figure was 498 kills, with a ratio around 2.3 to 1 in that theatre. Even allowing for the fog of war, overlapping fires, duplicate claims, burning hulks seen from multiple angles, the shape of the record stayed consistent. The Hellcat traded well, and it did it with a style of fighting that rewarded movement and punished predictability. Then came the battlefield proof, and Arracourt in September 1944 was the kind of environment where the Hellcat looked perfectly at home. Fog and broken terrain compressed sight lines, turned armoured contact into sudden flashes of opportunity, and made reaction speed and positioning feel more important than who had the thickest front plate. This was where the Hellcat turned speed into execution. Units shifted quickly into threatened sectors, built ambushes with time to spare, hit German armour as it committed into a lane, and displaced immediately, so return fire chased a position that no longer mattered. One of the most cited snapshots from that fighting centered on the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion. On September 19, 1944, in the fog near Arracourt, an M18 platoon engagement unfolded so fast, it read like the Hellcat's doctrine made real. Multiple German tanks were knocked out in minutes, and one M18 commanded by Sergeant Henry R. Hartman was credited with knocking out 6 of them, often described as Panthers. By the end of the battle, the 704th was credited with 39 German tanks knocked out, for 4 M18s destroyed and 3 damaged, which was exactly the kind of exchange that made commanders trust the vehicle in fast, fluid anti-armor fights. Then the Ardennes tightened the battlefield even further. December 1944 wasn't wide maneuver and long sight lines. It was forests and villages anchored on crossroads, with armor moving in columns, where a single burning vehicle could reshape the advance behind it. That was the environment tank destroyer doctrine had been built for. Rapid response, concentrated firepower, and meeting the enemy at the decisive approach instead of arriving after the crisis had already rolled past. Around Bastogne, the Hellcat story tied into Team Dessabry near Neuville, where a small task force tried to hold key approaches while the German offensive pressed forward, and Hellcats were part of the defense. In that fighting, the combined action near Neuville was commonly described as destroying at least 30 German tanks, and across the siege period, the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion was widely described as destroying around 40 German tanks while losing 6 M18s, which matched the vehicle's purpose perfectly. Strike hard at the moment of contact, then keep repositioning as part of a combined defense. This was the part that explained why the Hellcat's ratio stayed high, even though it wasn't built to absorb punishment. In the Ardennes, a single kill could trigger a chain effect, because a lead vehicle burning on a narrow road created hesitation, bunching, reroutes and delays, and those delays bought defenders time for artillery to work, time for infantry to dig in, and time to reset the geometry of the fight. The Hellcats didn't just remove tanks, they disrupted tempo, and tempo disruption was often the difference between an attack that kept rolling and an attack that stalled out in the trees. So, the M18 built its record. The question becomes, why did it remain overlooked? The answer started with simple math and constant presence, because numbers didn't just shape logistics in World War II, they shaped what people saw, photographed, and remembered. The Hellcat existed in 2,507 copies, while the Sherman rolled out in 49,324, and that gap created 2 very different kinds of visibility. The Sherman appeared in every long campaign sequence because it was always there in the center of the story. The push forward, the grinding days on the road, the towns taken, the liberation shots, the steady presence that stayed in memory, even when the details blurred. The Hellcat's war looked different. It entered serious combat service in 1944, and its production ended by October 1944, which gave it a narrower window to become a household name, even while it delivered strong results in the period that mattered most. Its best work often happened in sharp, compressed moments, and those moments rarely produced the kind of continuous footage and iconic imagery that turned vehicles into symbols. Then there was role, and role shaped storytelling. A tank destroyer battalion was built as a reaction force, and reaction forces didn't always ride at the tip of the main advance. They lived in the moments where the enemy tried to claw the initiative back, where armor surged into a gap, where a counterattack had to be broken quickly before it grew teeth. That kind of work won wars, but it often stayed quiet in memory because it didn't always look like progress on a map. It looked like stopping something before it became a disaster. Yet inside the Army's own language, inside the numbers, the after-action reports, and the way crews describe what worked, the Hellcat's legacy stayed sharp. It took a practical 76mm gun and made it more dangerous through positioning. It treated speed as protection and mobility as control, and it delivered results at a ratio that stayed among the best in its class. That was why the Hellcat mattered even without becoming the poster vehicle, because it proved something armies kept learning the hard way. Survivability wasn't only armor thickness, it was also the ability to control when the fight began, where the shot came from, and how quickly you could change the problem for the enemy. The M18 turned speed into position into first shot kills, and it did it often enough that the record became hard to shrug off. 526 claimed tank kills against 216 losses, a ratio commonly cited around 2.4 to 1 overall. Built in smaller numbers and arriving late, it still embodied what US tank destroyer doctrine had always wanted. A weapon that appeared at the decisive point, hit cleanly, and moved before the battlefield could answer. And if the Sherman was the steady fist of American armor, the Hellcat was the quick cut. Sharp, mobile, efficient, and remembered most clearly by the people who saw it arrive from an angle they didn't expect.